So we need to start minimizing the emissions, but at the same time, we have so much CO2 in the atmosphere that we also have to try to take that CO2 from the atmosphere and put it into storage. So you all know about the emission problem and that we reduce the consumption and transport and all that pollution generated by what we do. But then there is also this whole thing about how do we take CO2 and convert it into storage? So their technological options, their land use change options, and can we actually do a lot to enhance the natural processes? Those are the adaptive measures which we should consider. So again, I'll show you the latest in CO2. It's increasing at an unprecedented rate. And if you look at all the emissions, China is the biggest, US is the second biggest, and so on and so on. And what is very interesting to me is you probably all know how much money you make on an annual basis. Do you know how much tons of CO2 you generate per year? Have you ever given thought about that? It's very difficult to calculate, but I think you should start thinking about what is your carbon footprint. And I will have a question for you later on. And I put a chart together on the average per capita tons of CO2 in your country for each one of your participants. And you can look it up after you get the answer. But I want you to think a little bit about how much CO2 do you actually generate. So when we look at the emissions, business as usual, this is what's going to happen in terms of the amount of CO2 which is generated. So if we do anything, this is what happens. If we want to get to a 1.5 degree reduction, this is how much we need to reduce it. And if we want to go to a 2, we have to reduce it dramatically. So that means if you look at this, a 2.7% increase in CO2 in 2008 is far higher than it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so on. The emissions rate in 2018, the latest data I have is about 55 gigatons. 5 gigatons is from land use changes. So a good amount is actually from land use changes. So when you look at where the CO2 comes from, some of it comes from fertilizers, some of it comes from animals. Remember the cows and the goats and the sheep, they burp about 19 times a day, and every time they burp, they generate CO2. In fact, they have methane, not CO2. In fact, New Zealand did a study where they looked, you know, the green New Zealand island. They did a study and they have lots of forests, imperata forests, all kinds of good forests. And they calculated that they are in a positive situation in terms of carbon footprint. And then they looked at the 30 million sheep they had, and they calculated how much methane that is generating and converted it into CO2, and they discovered that they're in a negative situation. So animals are a considerable problem. Deforestation is a problem. And of course, all kinds of water activities is a problem. So in order to meet the target, we need to reduce our emission by 55%. This is massive. So here is what happens to agriculture. This is the amount from the animals. This is the amount from manure and pasture. This is the amount from manure management, from fertilizers, from rice, from burning. A lot of farms burn their trash and the fuel they use. So you can see agriculture in terms of percentages, producing meat is not only a huge CO2 generator, but it's also the most water consumptive way to produce food. And I will show you that tomorrow. So you know what to do about reducing emissions, fossil fuel, travel. We're saving huge amount of CO2 by not all going to Italy. But obviously from a human entertainment point, it's probably not as effective. Changing heating systems, changing diets, consumption. That's the thing we need to do in emission. But I won't talk too much about that because other people know this much better than I. But what I want to talk about is how we reduce this emission and store the thing with what we do in mountains. So if you look at the estimated current annual carbon emissions, this is what deforestation and land use change in soils do per year, about 1.6 billion tons. Current fossil emissions is about 8.3. So compare that. And so the total anthropogenic emissions is about 10 billion tons per year. So the oceans absorb quite a lot. The atmosphere has a lot. And then there is some which we cannot account for on a global scale. So the terrestrial carbon pool is the biotic storage, that's all in the trees and the plants. And then there's the soil storage, that's the carbon in the soil. And so if you look at this, the amount of carbon that is stored in the vegetation is about 560 billion tons. Compare that to the amount of carbon stored in soils. So about 5 times roughly. Some of it is underground for the trees' roots, and some is of above ground and below ground. And the same thing is in the soil. But when you then look in the soil carbon, you see a huge difference in the inorganic part and the organic part. So the inorganic part is carbon in carbonates, and the organic one is all the humus and all that kind of stuff. So if you look at the ocean pool and the carbon pool and the atmospheric pool, the carbon pool in the soil is actually very important. So we have all kinds of ways to sequester carbon. The engineers are telling us we can pump CO2 from the air and capture it by compressing air and then inject it into geological formation. You probably have heard about this. A lot of companies are talking about doing this. To me, this is absolute nonsense because from an energy point of view, this makes no sense to me whatsoever because, first of all, compressing air is extremely difficult. And injecting it into underground formations is not very good either because we know that most of these underground formations, they leak. So it takes huge amounts of energy. Some colleagues of mine at the university have done some studies on the energy demand to do this. This is a non-starter, although it's being promoted and whatever. Also, you can pump CO2 into the ocean, but that's not a good idea either because that will increase the acidity in the ocean. So I would say ignore these for the time being because maybe we have some really intelligent innovators who can do this, but I'm not sure we can. But let's look at the natural processes. So we can store carbon in the terrestrial system or we can store it in the aquatic system. But in the aquatic system, you have this problem with the ocean where the acidification is a huge issue. So ignore this for the time being. So the options we have is in the terrestrial environment, we can improve it in terms of what we do in agriculture. We can improve it in what we do in forestry, and we can improve it in what we do with wetlands. And this is what I call biomass carbon sequestration. So if you look at soils, and soils have very different carbons. Different soils have different carbons. Some of them have lots of it, and some of them have little, and some of it is underground, and some of it is in the surface. Our good friend who is going to give a lecture in the soils will explain to you much better than I will. But here is what I want to talk about. Some of the best soils are in a semi-arid grassland environment in the US, in the Canadian prairies, in the Ukraine, and in Russia. Why? Grassland converts far more carbon into the soil than any other plants because there is biomass in the root system of grasses and above ground. And they decompose on a regular basis, which means you continuously increase the carbon to a certain extent. So the Canadian prairies is 80% of the Canadian farmland, and it's all grassland like this. And we have started with about 6% of carbon in the soil when the prairies were native soils. And then we went to conventional till farming. We converted all these grasslands into agricultural land. So we started tilling, and over a 100-year period, we have gone from that amount of carbon to that amount of carbon, because whenever we till it, we aerate the soil and we reduce the carbon content. And now we're saying we should do conservation farming, which means we should either not plow it or grow a cover crop or do all kinds of things so we can actually start increasing that carbon which we lost. We figure in the best part of the agricultural land in Canada, we lost about 2/3 of the carbon pool because of converting grasslands into agriculture. And so if we would actually encourage better growth of grasslands and use all kinds of conservation measures in agriculture, we could actually reduce the CO2 emission in agriculture by about 10%. So if we then look at carbon sequestration in forestry and grassland, agriculture, and degraded land, the very best option of moving new carbon into the soil is in degraded grasslands. Because the degraded grasslands have been eroded and all the top carbon is in the topsoil, and that has been lost. So if we can encourage degraded grasslands, this is the best option we have to sequester carbon. We can still do it in forestry, but much less so. And we can improve the current grasslands, which are not, and the worst part is agriculture. So all of these can actually help to sequester carbon. So the red is showing you the losses, the green is showing you the gains by doing innovative measures. So increasing soil carbon. So it will produce more we can produce more biomass above ground and below ground. We can fertilize and irrigate best beneficial management practices, which increases more biomass. We can add organic matter from other sources, and I'll show you how some people do that. We can plant crop rotation, which encourages new carbon. We can grow legumes, which use nitrogen from the air, which we don't need fertilizer. We can use green manure, which means we grow a crop and then plow it under, or we do no till. And we can improve the grazing of the land. This is how we can increase it. This is how we decrease it. So we till and aerate it. We don't maintain the vegetation. We have erosion. So we can decrease these these losses by doing all of these things. So the soil carbon gains in crops are about 1 megatons. They're about 0.68 megagrams per gram per hectare. And for forestry, it's about that. So this is giving you a bit of an idea. So carbon losses, you can see when we degrade these things, carbon losses are quite high in all of these things. So if you compare growing corn with a popular plantation, you can see you don't generate a lot of carbon when you grow corn because you remove most of it above ground. But if you grow a popular farm, you can increase it significantly, in some cases more than others. So this is the gram of carbon per kilogram of soil, and this is the stable carbon in percent. So you can actually, 24% of the carbon is stable in corn as opposed to almost a third. So conservation efforts in carbon farming can actually reduce about 0.5 ppms of CO2 per year, which means about 50 ppms over 100 years. So rehabilitating the degraded grasslands has the highest potential for carbon sequestration. Degraded cropland also has a potential, but you have to be careful. You cannot continuously increase carbon forever in the soil because there is a saturation point. And it's about 15% of organic matter. Beyond that, it's very difficult to increase it. So the agronomic actions which can improve carbon sequestration are all of these. You can minimize tillage, you can mulch, you can reduce the erosion, you can manage the fertilizer better, you can manage the water better, and you can manage the crop better. And all of these will help you improve the carbon content. The Nepalis are quite interestingly adaptive to increasing carbon into their soil, and I will show you how they actually do that. So if you look, for example, at Canada, this is where in the last 10 years, we have been able to increase the carbon in the soil. And these are the areas where we actually decrease the carbon in the soil because of very intensive agriculture. So large increases in green, moderate increases in light green, moderate decreases in orange, and very large decreases in red. So enhanced natural processes to increase by reforestation, improving grasslands and rehabilitate degraded lands is probably the best option. And frontier technologies have some potential, like biochar additions, perennial grain crop breeding can improve these things, more root formation. So we could actually generate plants which generate more roots. We can also use some geological absorptions. Then the people in Iceland do this quite effectively. They pump air from CO2 into their volcanic fissures because there is a lot of carbon in their geological formation, which means it creates carbon carbonate, which is then stable. We can also add iron to the water, particularly to the ocean, and that will sequester more carbon. But that is a very dangerous thing because we don't know what that will do globally. So this is where we can do something. So let's look at the importance of soil carbon in the context of what they do in the Himalayas. So the benefit of carbon is manifold. The first thing, if you put more carbon into your soil, it can hold more water. the water availability is much greater if you add carbon to your soil, the humus part. It will then mean that the plants have more water available, it reduces the plant stress during drought, and it will increase biomass production. The next thing is you can increase soil nutrient. Adding carbon means the soil can hold more nutrients, particularly nitrogen, nitrate, ammonia, that kind of stuff. Again, it improves the biomass, it makes more different plant nutrients available, reduces the leaching, and so on. So it holds more water, it improves the nutrients. It creates, because all the organisms require carbon, it creates a much greater microbial activity, which enriches species diversity, improves decomposition, provides nutrients to plants, and lo and behold, the most interesting thing are the fungi. We have more fungi than anything else in the soil system. And these fungi, the fungus, you don't like, but that fungus does all kinds of wonderful things, like it moves water and nutrients from one plant to the other, and lots of wonderful things. So not only does it do that, the organic matter in soils increases the infiltration capacity, the amount of water which can infiltrate. If you don't have carbon in your soil, it doesn't infiltrate very well, which means we can reduce the erosion by more water infiltration. It reduces waterlogging and flooding, and so it helps. So converting CO2 into soil storage is absolutely critical. So this is a complicated graph, but you need to understand this if you're not in the soil science environment. The amount of water, so the soil water, which is available to plants, is between total saturation, fill capacity, and the wilting point. Where there is not enough water, the plants start wilting. So between these two lines, this is the amount of water which is available to the plants. In a sand, you get very little room. Sand doesn't hold a lot of water, it just flows through it. Clay holds quite a lot. So depending on the particle size of your soil, the amount of available water for the plants varies. So here is the wilting point, that's unavailable to the plant. Here's the available part, and then this is the gravitational part. From here onwards, it will disappear from your soil. So what happens when you add carbon to your field capacity? If you add a lot of carbon to sand, you can actually increase, if you add 2% carbon to your sand, you can actually increase the water holding capacity dramatically. So this shows you that if you want to hold more water in the soil, the more carbon you can get into it, the better for your holding water for the plants. Skip that. So the best water holding capacity is in wetlands, in bogs, and in marshes, and in fens, and in shallow water, and so on. The bogs are interesting in they only get all their precipitation and their nutrients from rainfall. So rain doesn't have a lot of nutrients. That means you don't get many trees growing in bogs. So bogs are totally wet. There is no oxygen in the water, or very little, which means all the organic matter is in storage. And it's interesting, in Holland, they had a big bog, and they're very beautiful environments, so they created a park of the bog. And all these Labrador tea and small growing plants, no trees, look like a very attractive landscape. And then after about 10 years, they discovered that the trees started growing. So they said, well, why are the trees growing when this is a very low nutrient environment and only has sufficient nutrients for these little shrubby plants? Well, it turns out that because of the intensive agriculture, the air pollution, the nitrate in the air pollution was relatively high. And this stimulated actually enough nutrients for the trees to grow. So a fen is a wetland where water flows from the land into the wetland. And when it flows over the land, it picks up nutrients and allows other plants like shrubs and trees to grow. So they're very different wetlands which we need to think about, but all of these wetlands store a huge amount of carbon. So one of our participants in the IPROMO workshop, Adrian Ward, did his PhD thesis at the University of Queensland in Australia by looking at how much carbon is actually in storage in grass and shrublands in all the mountain environments of the world. And so he looked at the various countries and he looked at the area in shrub and grassland, and he looked at how much of the carbon is stored in these different countries in the mountains. This is all mountain stuff, okay? And lo and behold, when you look at this, you can see it's quite a lot of billion tons. And then you look at our colleagues from the Andes, and you look at the carbon stock this is on a country basis, and then go to this. So if you look at the mean sea density in tons per hectares, this is what these countries have, and this is what these countries have. And these countries have the largest, most incredible wetlands, which have the highest carbon storage anywhere in the world. The global average is 60 tons. Look at what they have over here. It's covered up in my part by, I can't show it to you, but hopefully you can see it. This is what these wetlands look like. They're called the IPROMO. These are the best wetlands, and many of these wetlands provide the drinking water for capital cities like Bogota, Cali, Quito, and other places. And the big challenge is they get their water from the glaciers. And the big question is, what happens to these wetlands when the glaciers no longer provide sufficient water? Can we actually maintain that storage? So if you look at the tons of sea which is stored in the mountain grassland and shrubland areas, you can see that these mountain areas, our Ugandan people will be quite happy that they actually have lots of carbon stored in the mountains. And Venezuela, Rwanda, and so on. These are the countries where we have lots of carbon in the wetlands. And we first of all need to preserve those. And the second thing we need to do is encourage to create more of it. So in Nepal, they do a very interesting thing. They obviously need to produce a lot of food in the mountains because the whole country is mountainous except for the Terai. And so they go to the forest and they collect the litter and then apply it to agriculture to maintain the organic matter in the agriculture, to not only improve the infiltration capacity, the water holding capacity, the nutrient holding capacity, and this means they can maintain their agriculture in very mountainous environment. But the pressure on the forest is very great because you're removing all the carbon. And then you end up with forests like this, which are pine forests, and you can see there's virtually no litter left on the ground. So you're removing the carbon from the soils in the forest, but you're improving the carbon in agriculture. So here's the example in close-up. You can see there's virtually no carbon left Every year they collect the whole thing. And as the forests become more and more pine dominated, then you use pine litter for your storage, and that's bad news. Why is this bad news? Well, pine needles create very acidic soils. When the pine needles, they don't decompose very fast, and they have all kinds of organic compounds which are water repellent, and then they create acidification, which is not very good for soils in the environment, for agriculture. So how can we actually improve the carbon? Because what happened in Nepal is they had a lot of indigenous forests with lots of biodiversity, but because the demand was so high on certain kind of tree species, which used for animal feed, these are fodder trees, that these fodder trees almost disappeared because they were being lobbed for the leaves to be fed to the animals. So we had two ways of carbon removal from the forest. One is by litter collection, and the second by fodder collection from leaves. And because of that, a lot of the plantations became pine, because the people who started afforestation said, well, if we grow fodder trees, people will use them and they won't become a forest because it's under such high demand. So they started planting pine because pine is a tree which nobody likes, because first of all, the firewood spits in the house when you cook with it. It creates acidification for soils, and people will lose it alone except once it's big enough for construction of housing and so on. So we said, well, how could we actually increase not only the carbon in the soil, but what should we do with pine litter versus broadleaf litter? So we used pine to look at what happens in soil when you just add pine litter. What happens if you use different kinds of broadleaf species? And in fact, Titonia is a kind of a weed, which I learned by working in the Philippines. Some of the Philippine mountains have the oldest rice fields in the world. They're terraced rice fields. And they told me when I was working there that they never used fertilizer. And I was very skeptical, and I said, well, that can't be. Yeah, for hundreds and hundreds of years you grow rice and no fertilizer? That's impossible. So they said, no, we use Titonia, because it grows as shrubs around the rice fields, and we collect the leaves and incorporate it into the rice field. So we did some studies and looked at Titonia, and Titonia leaves have actually a very high carbon content. So we did a nasty thing. We took some seeds and took them to Nepal, and we started some experiments. So here are the experiments. So if we use pine litter, and we add pine litter every 6 months, and then look at the soil, what happens to pH. So these are the red soils and these are the non-red soils. So if every 6 months you add pine litter and you see how much can you increase the carbon, so you decrease the pH, but you increase the carbon. And so in terms of the non-red soils, we were able, by adding 10 kilograms per square meter over 6 months, we were able to increase the carbon quite significantly. And we were able to increase one as well. If we then use these Titonia, sun hemp, and pigeon peas, some of these are leguminous, so they actually generate nitrogen from the air. You can see we were able to actually, with Titonia, increase the carbon content in the soil much better than with the pine, because we didn't create too much acidity. Another experiment which is very important, which we did to increase the sequester of carbon, is we had these little blocks here. So this is one where we grow lemongrass. We limed it one time, we limed it 2 times, we put manure, we put double manure, lime and manure, and lime double manure. Whoops, sorry, back. So I don't need to show you the data, but you can see by applying lime 1 times, you got a massive production of lemongrass with lots of roots storing lots of carbon. So again, this is a good example on how we can actually sequester carbon in soil by not only using grasses, which generate lots of root biomass, but also lime, which stabilizes the carbon into carbonates. So liming and organic matter additions is a very good thing. And most people do this in agriculture if they want to have sustainable soil management. That gets me back to the green water management. Remember, we talked about blue water and then the green water. So 65% of the green water goes through this cycle, and we don't manage it very well. We had a project in Egypt where they got very little rainfall. They get about 5 storms a year. And when the storms come, because it's so dry, the storms go through these systems and they're gone within 24 hours. Just the wadis, it's like a flash flood going through the wadis. If you put in these little obstructions, very simple obstructions, you can hold that water back so that it can infiltrate. You can actually increase the amount of water in these soils sufficiently that you can grow a crop of barley over the year. This is what I talk about green water management. And if you can add carbon, so grow some grasses for the first and second year to increase the carbon, you can actually do even more. And at the same time, you're putting the carbon into storage, which obviously, if you don't plow it, you're doing a good job. So, can you actually do this in some of these most degraded lands in the world? We had some of these problems in our Nepal watershed where we worked for a long time. And my students said, we need to do something about this. And I looked at them and said, you're crazy. There is no way I can rehabilitate this site in my lifetime. I'm too old to see the success of this whole thing. But then we thought about it, and they pushed me, and I said, well, let's try something. Let's see if we can do this degraded land and convert it into something which is productive and stores carbon in the soil. So we did all kinds of experiments. The very first thing we did is we started a tree nursery. And we said, we're going to plant trees in this area. But we're only going to plant trees which do not create acidification. And we want to plant trees which the people can actually use. So we said we're only going to plant fodder trees. Nepal has about 25 different types of fodder trees, which they grow, and the people actually collect the leaves and feed it to the animals. Well, remember, when you collect the trees, you cut the branches quite often. And so when you cut the branches, the trees usually don't get to bloom. So we wanted seedlings of all these little fodder trees, and there was nothing available anywhere in the market. So we went to farmers and we paid them $20 and said, do not cut this tree for a year or two so that we can get some seeds. And so we got some seeds, and then we started planting these different seeds. And then we did an experiment. We said, we want only trees which can fix nitrogen from the air. And then we want fodder trees which can accept mycorrhizal fungi. Now, this is probably all crazy for you, but a fungus, a mycorrhizal fungus, is an organism which can take phosphorus, which is insoluble, and convert it into soluble phosphorus and make it then available to the plants. So we wanted fodder trees which can fix nitrogen from the air, fix phosphorus with the mycorrhizal fungi, and are useful for the people. That means we don't have to fertilize. And hopefully there is enough water in the soil when we add organic matter to do this. So we started growing these different fodder trees in hedgerows. We did some experiments in the lab to see which one of these different fodder trees accept the mycorrhizal fungi, because the fungus is a funny thing. It lives in the roots and takes the phosphorus from the soil and converts it into the plants. But some trees don't like that. They don't like that fungus in the roots. So some accept it and some don't, and we didn't know which one. So we finally found about 3 which do that, and those are the ones which we collected. So if you look at this in 1994, this is what it looked like. So you then started doing these hedgerows, and we planted them, and in a few years later it looked something like that. And then in 2001 it looked something like that. And what we have done now is we have created a biodiversity garden. And what we do is we get the women who look after the animals to come into this forest and collect twice a year some of the things they want to collect. But they have to give us information what was good for their animals and what was not good for their animals. So now we have a good idea what of these fodder trees are good for feed, create carbon in the soil, create biomass, and cover the area so it's no longer eroding. So this was an interesting experiment, but unfortunately, we have lost complete control over the experiment, because every time a visitor comes in, they come with new ideas. And they say, oh, here's another tree which you might consider. But this is all positive, because now we have enough knowledge that we can transfer this to all kinds of community forests to say, why don't you use trees which are useful for people in terms of biomass, which are useful for soil sequestration, and will stop erosion. The reason why we did this initially is because this area created so much sediment that all the farmers in the lowland had troubles with sediment in their irrigation system. They had to spend huge amounts of effort every year to dig out all the sediment out of the channels. And now we virtually have no erosion taking place. So even if it looks totally hopeless when you off with this kind of thing, with a good initiative with lots of young students with bright ideas, you can actually do quite a lot in carbon sequestration. So here is one of the trees which grew the fastest. This is a tree which grew over 5 years. These are the ones which were very successful. These were the ones which were not so successful. So we have now a good knowledge base to actually do this. So a strategy for maximizing carbon in degraded headwaters, mixed forest, a combination of these, shrub and grasses. This enhances the soil, incorporate legume compost and lime, use agroforestry to enhance all this, which means you can maximize the carbon, you can minimize the impact, you can reduce the fire risk by diversity, you can maintain higher mass productivity, you create environmental services, and you can minimize the storm effects and erosion. And so this is the complex interactions which might give you some ideas on how you can do that. So in conclusion, enhancing the resilience in degraded watersheds by different type of vegetation cover and by enhancing the soil, you can make everything more productive, you can make it more environmentally friendly, and you can actually absorb carbon in your soil, which will be in permanent storage if you maintain the management in a proper way. So thank you for that. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Hans. It was a really, really interesting, as usual, your presentation and what you talk about. There was a question, but we have to thank really much Rosa Laura, which have already shared the requested link on the chat. Beatriz Funtealba asked if you could share the reference to find the word thesis, and Rosa Laura already shared the web link. I tried to download it and it worked perfectly.
Great.
Okay. There are some questions from Lupa. So agriculture contributes from 11 to 14% of CO2, but there are two forms of this livestock management system, that is intensive and extensive. Among the two animal management system, which one has been considered the worst source of CO2? Knowing that intensive is engineering, while extensive pastoralism is solar powered.
Intensive is the worst kind of thing we can do. I will show you tomorrow why. Because intensive livestock production creates more CO2 and uses more water than any other food we produce. And the interesting thing about livestock production, if you look at an animal basis, if you do feedlot beef production versus grazing land production, the amount is very similar, which you would not have expected. You would have expected the grazing land would be more efficient in terms of water than the intensive. But the difference is this. Because in the grazing situation, you leave the animals much longer on the range than in intensive agriculture where you force feed them. And so from a water point of view, there is no difference. From a carbon point of view, there's a huge difference. So if you produce food in intensive feedlot systems, that is the worst case you can take. If you grow it in grazing land, at least the grazing land will maintain the carbon in your soil. And so the suggestion for me is, if you are really environmentally conscious, don't eat too much meat to reduce your carbon footprint. But for the mountain people, they still need animals for security during the winter. So that's probably the best compromise, by having grazing land, beef production in mountains, rather than importing that beef from intensive areas from the lowland.
Okay, thanks. There is another question from Paul Cisneros. Would like if you would like to know if you can share the reference for the figure on tons of carbon sequestered by paramos and other ecosystems.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, in one of the slides, the thesis from the student is already given, but I'll dig it out and send it to you.
Okay, thanks.
Remember, the Paramo is the best wetland in the world with the largest carbon storage. So preserve it.
Okay, there is another question by Beatriz. thank you for share all these experiences. You have some experience with peatlands. They have also a saturation point to increase carbon soil, or what are the key points to conserve carbon stocks?
Oh, the carbon flux. Well, I mean, trees control the carbon flux quite extensively. And so there is the big dilemma, do trees or grasses change the flux? And I don't have the answer. I have been talking to all these biometeorologists to find out what is actually better in terms of carbon sequestration, because trees store a lot of the carbon in the biomass and grasses store a lot of it in the roots. Well, both of them are good, but which one is better? And I don't know the answer. And so far, nobody has really come up with this. This is quite intriguing because I looked at my property and I said, I have a few trees and I have a bit of lawn. Should I push more lawn or should I have more trees? Which one is better? And I'm not sure which one is better. Both of them are good. And we need to do much more research in terms of looking at the whole carbon footprint, because when you have a lawn, you cut the lawn. And that means you need energy, and then you create more carbon dioxide and so on. So this is a very tricky situation, but generally speaking, I would say both of them are important. And depending on where you are, one might be better than another, but it all depends on the type of trees and the type of grasses which you think.
Okay, many thanks. Another question from Lupa. What is different between marsh and swamps? Maybe the ecosystem is the same, but the components in it are different.
Yeah, there is a lot of naming of different wetlands, which makes everybody very confusing. There is the bog and there's the fen. The bog is wetlands which get all their rain and all their nutrients from rainfall. A fen or a marsh or whatever is when the rainfall flows over the land surface into the wetland. And in a process, it picks up nutrients and make it more enriched. And that means there is more possibility for trees to grow, like trees and so on. In a bog, you never grow any trees because there's not enough nutrients. But in a fen and a marsh and everything else, all you need to worry about is the water went through the soil or over the soil, brought in more nutrients, which allows more biomass to produce. And remember, these things were grown over thousands of years. In fact, a bog is growing every year by minuscule amounts, like a millimeter or more, and it grows up, and it creates actually little hills. So carbon is not only sequestered in the bottom, but it also grows on top.
Okay. So thank you very much, Hans, for this very, very interesting lecture. And as a, let's say, tradition, and it's only the second time in this course, now I'm opening all the microphones so we can thanks Hans by clapping our hands, and tomorrow we can enjoy again. And see you tomorrow.
So we'll see you tomorrow, same time. And I hope you have a rest of a wonderful day. Our day is just starting.
Thank you very much. See you tomorrow, everybody.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao.